While there are many factors that dictate a Pokemon's success, like typing, stats, move pool, etc., the environment of a Pokemon is by far one of the most important ones. For example, Snorlax was an amazing Pokemon in Generation 2 because it was the perfect storm from him. If normal types weren't so overpowered and fighting type moves weren't basically non-existent, it wouldn't have been so good. It was because of the specific context that it was introduced in. In the same way, there are Pokemon that would have had more success if they had been introduced in past gens. So for some context, we're going to abide by the mechanics of the generation. So no talking about fairy types pre-Generation 6, or no Dark and Steel types pre-Generation 3. And if we're talking about a certain Pokemon and it has an ability or a move that doesn't exist yet in that gen, we will be ignoring that. We will be fitting the Pokemon into the gen that we're talking about. Delphox. Previous to Generation 4, there was no physical special split, which meant that lots of Pokemon were forced to be mixed attackers, or they couldn't use both of their stab attacks. This was something that even the top Pokemon in the format had to submit to, like Tyranitar, who wanted to use physical rock-type moves and its special dark-type moves. Therefore, it's one of the most prominent mixed attackers. Or Gengar, who is a special attacker, but whose both of its typings fell within the physical spectrum. However, this wasn't too much of an issue in Generation 1 and 2 because you could max out stats. Natures didn't exist yet, so you didn't really need to make much more sacrifices. Until Generation 3, where Pokemon like Tyranitar and Breloom were forced to pick and choose, now that natures were a thing. Which brings us to Delphox. Delphox is pretty meh. It is an overall disappointing starter who debuted in the RU tier. Its offensive typing for the modern games is kind of meh, since Psychic isn't as good as it used to be, and its stat spread is passable, but not necessarily great. Admittedly, it has also two abilities that don't really help it at all. However, I believe that if introduced in Generation 2 and 3, Delphox would have been OU material. While yes, dark types were a significant threat to Psychics in Generation 2, Psychic types were still near the peak of their power, Exeggutor, Alakazam, and Starmie being some of the most prominent Pokemon in GSCOU. Delphox also boasts a 102 speed stat, which would make it the third fastest Psychic type. It would also be the fastest Fire type in the tier, mostly because there are no Fire types in the OU tier in Gen 2. And the only notable Fire type who can actually take advantage of both of their stat typings in Generation 3 is Haydunn. In Generation 3, it would have been a great choice, given that it has a type advantage against some of the top Pokemon, like Metagross, Jirachi, Skarmory, and Celebi. Next is Brambleghast. Brambleghast has two traits that basically guaranteed a niche. In Generation 2 OU, those being, it's a ghost type and it has access to spikes. And in Generation 2, basically all teams need a spiker and a spin blocker. What's even better is that there's a total of 0 Pokemon who have this combination. Additionally, it's able to actually be a good physical ghost type. In Gen 2, there were only 2 ghost types. One was Mischievous, and the other was the Gengar line. Mischievous was mainly used as a spin blocker who can tank more hits because Gengar is rather frail, and in addition to that, it has a 90 base speed stat, which yeah, it does not seem like a lot, but this is Generation 2, the power level is much lower. This means that in the OU tier, only 6 Pokemon actually outspeed it. Brambleghast would definitely have a spot secured on several teams, because in Gen 2 OU, there just isn't any Pokemon who have the same combinations of attributes as he is. And there is definitely no ghost type that can use Shadow Ball the way he can. Since yeah, Gengar has access to it and you can't max out your stats, but he's obviously much more of a special attacker. Next is Crocodile. Crocodile is a very beloved Pokemon, but it surprisingly has never made it to the OU tier. And I say that because while its stats aren't bad, it has probably one of the greatest offensive typings ever seen in Ground and Dark, along with 3 great abilities. It was introduced in Generation 5, but in Generation 5 and onwards, the power levels were too high for him to keep up with. I believe that in Generation 4 though, he would have made a great Pokemon, partly because of how he matches up against the top mons in Gen 4, like Tyranitar, Jirachi, Metagross, and Magneton. While Dark and Ground are good in any context, it's perfect for DPPOU. Crocodile's most notable sets are usually Bandit and Scarf sets, as he's used as a mostly all-out attacker, usually having Earthquake, Crunch, Superpower, Pursuit, and has access to utility moves in Toxic and Taunt. He could also work as a lead since he has access to Stealth Rock. Overall, he's a really great Pokemon. One of the main reasons that he was never really able to break into the OU tier is because, among others, his speed stat. He's not a slow Pokemon, but he doesn't cross the benchmark of 100. And while that's still not great for Gen 4 OU, again, the power level is lower, that leaves him with a lot more openings. Since in Gen 5 OU, there are other faster ground types running around, like Excadrill, Garchomp, and Landorus. But Excadrill doesn't exist yet, neither does Landorus, and Garchomp is still banned, so he would have much less competition as well. And there is a good lack of dark types. It's clear there's a spot for him, especially with the lack of good physically offensive dark types, as there's Tyranitar, Weavile, but not much else other than that. Especially since a lot of dark types at this point are much more utility oriented, like Umbreon or Spiritomb. Next is Rhyhorn. It's a pretty commonly known fact that Normal and Psychic are both absolutely overpowered in Generation 1. The most important physical attackers are by far Normal types and Psychics, with Alakazam, Tauros, and Snorlax being some of the best Pokemon around. So obviously a Pokemon with both of those typings would be amazing. There's a few Normal and Psychic types that exist, but I narrowed it down to Indeedee and Rhyhorn, ultimately deciding on Rhyhorn. I ultimately decided on Rhyhorn mainly because of his higher physical attack stat. Yes, Indeedee has a higher speed stat, but I think the ability to dish off strong body slams off of a Rhyhorn is much more menacing, especially when you take into consideration that his slower speed stat can potentially just not matter at all since he can be used as a curse sweeper, purely being used by Snorlax at this point. And Indeedee doesn't have a boosting move as good as that, since she does not have access to Amnesia. Rhyhorn has access to Double Edge though, one of the most common normal type attacks, again being used mostly by Snorlax and Tauros. Along with those stats and Reflect, you got a good Pokemon. The cherry on top is also that he has access to Hypnosis and Thunder Wave, which at this point is something that only Hypno has access to, as he's basically a good mix of Snorlax, Hypno with his ability to spread Hypnosis and Thunder Wave, and Alakazam being able to dish out strong Psychic type attacks. Next is Noivern. Noivern never saw much competitive success in Gen 6 when it was introduced. That's partly because Gen 6 was also when the Fairy type was introduced, and there were lots of other better Dragon types that were just much more offensively menacing. But I believe that if it had debuted just one generation prior, it would have actually been very popular. This is mainly because of the context of Gen 5. It was a very offensive generation, with dragons running the tier and Hyper Offense and Weather being some of the most popular types of teams on there. There was also many speed ties amongst the dragons there, the Lottie Twins being among the fastest, at a 110 speed stat. However, Noivern outspeeds all of them, which means that he can hit first with a super effective 130 base powered Draco Meteor. Noivern would win all of those speed ties, as he wouldn't even need choice specs for guaranteed OHKOs. On top of that, he also has access to pivoting moves with U-turn that the other dragons don't have access to. Not only that, but with its ability Infiltrator, it will help it against certain matchups, particularly against the Lottie Twins, since lots of times players would try to use Substitute and Calm Mind in order to sweep. Besides that, it also has reliable Recovery and Roost, good utility moves in Taunt, and other great offensive options in Air Slash, Flamethrower, and Hurricane. And on top of that, in Generation 5, Hidden Powers still exist, which means that he can use moves like HP Fire to deal with Pokemon like Heatran. Overall, I feel like he would have been a great Pokemon, mostly just due to the fact that it outspeeds the other dragons. While its special attack stat may not look that impressive, when you have a move like an unnerfed Draco Meteor against an opponent who is weak to it, you don't need the highest attack stat to be able to make significant damage. This was my list of Pokemon that were introduced in quote-unquote the wrong generation. I could be wrong, and I know that there's more, but it really just goes to show how important the environment a Pokemon is in and its effects on its competitive viability.